This is the island of St. Helena, and it is by some distance the most remote place we've ever been to film the show. It is 1,800 nautical miles from South Africa, which means it's 1,800 nautical miles from the nearest vineyard, or thereabouts. So why on earth would we be here for a wine show? Well, for two reasons. One, it is wildly beautiful, and I've fallen in love with the place in the short space of time I've been here. But it also has a long and interesting history with wine, and in particular South African wine, because this is where Napoleon found himself exiled from 1815 to 1821, and he spent pretty much every single day of his exile here in St. Helena drinking the sweet wine of Constantia, wine that's appeared subsequently in the works of Jane Austen and other famous tomes like 50 Shades of Grey. Now that wine goes back to Groot Constantia and to Van der Constance as the current iterations of the wine that Napoleon so loved. And so later on the show today, we'll be trying those wines with the French consul in Napoleon's old home. It doesn't get more historically resonant than that. But that's not where we start on this week's show with Norman Goodfellows. Instead, we start with the other great sweet wine of the world, the one that put it on the map from a French perspective, and one that has an equally storied history, and one that drinks magnificently. That wine is Chateau, and I caught up with a cellar master to find out exactly what it is that makes this wine quite so perfect. Over the last few years, there's been a regular drive on Dan Really Likes Wine to try and convince South Africans to drink more of something we largely ignore, and that is the sweeter spectrum of wine, and not the demi-sec that's flying off shelves and across bar counters, especially in Johannesburg, but instead the wine for the end of the meal, that dessert wine, that sweeter wine that, because it's called sweet wine, people often disregard, oh, it's going to be sickly sweet, too saccharine, I don't want to try it, and then they do and realise it's a beautiful symphony of both sweet and savoury, and when made by South Africans is some of the best wine in the world. And in fact, if you look at the wine of Constantia, the Groot Constantia, the Van der Constance, you've got wine that probably is the best sweet wine in the world. However, there is one major contender, and that contender is a wine that around the world is known for being not just absolutely brilliant, but being iconic as one of the leaders of slightly sweeter wine. That wine, no surprises, is Chateau, and Tony is the cellar master in South Africa for the very first time. Welcome.
Exactly, thank you very much.
I can't believe it's taken us this long to get you to South Africa.
Yes. Me neither, but I'm here now.
And we're very happy you are. And the fact that you are here as the cellar master of Chateau obviously says that from your fortress in France, you've looked south and said, well, there must be a reason to come to South Africa. The market here must be worth visiting.
It's a very beautiful country with a rich culture, and I think a culture of wine that is very present. You are a very great producer of wines here, and I think when a country is a producer of wine, people here are always interested to taste the wines of the country and also the wines of the world. And also sweet wines in South Africa. I think they have a great place in the heart of the people because you make one of the best sweet wines of the world. So that's why we're here.
Well, that's what we have in common, you and South Africa, making this outstanding sweet wine. Before we look at your wine in particular, in South Africa, we often struggle a little to get people to try it. We don't sell as much as I think we should. We don't try as much as we should. What's that like in France? What's the culture of drinking sweet wine like?
I think it's a worldwide fact now that people, especially young generations, have less interest in sweet wines, unfortunately, because we have this generation gap, in France especially, where we think that the sweet wines or Sauternes wines are more for the grandpa and grandma, are more for Christmas with the foie gras only once a year, or for a baptism or for a wedding, so once in a life sometimes. But it's not really true when you go in the countryside of Sauternes, where we make this wine, where it's more frequently consumed and in other conditions than in Christmas dinners or lunches.
As a style of wine, the wine we have in South Africa, once people get to know it, they absolutely love it, and they've come to recognise a couple of key names. And I've mentioned two of those already, the Van der Constance and the Groot Constance. Chateau is probably the one sweet wine many South African wine drinkers will know, and that's because you have this extraordinary legacy. But for people who aren't familiar with Chateau, give us a little bit of the history of this remarkable brand.
It's more than 400 years old. It's one of the oldest chateaus in Bordeaux area. It has been in the same family for 400 years. This is a strong feature of Yquem. Then bought by LVMH Group in 1999. And through the history of Yquem, many things happened. especially during the French Revolution, where Yquem was under threat of disappearing, like any other chateau. But the heiress of the family at this time fought the battle to preserve the place, and she reorganized the place as we know it today, and she organized the way we make the wine. And this is why 4 years after her death in 1855, Yquem was classified the only Premier Cru supérieur of all Bordeaux, even above the Premier Cru of the red wines. So this is a very important thing because it makes Yquem really unique, and it shows us how important is this wine. And it's also a story of a fungus. It's a rot, noble rot, that will develop on the grapes, and we owe this fungus every year the existence of our wine. Without it, it's the real winemaker somehow. Without it, we cannot make Chateau d'Yquem.
For people who aren't familiar with this process, it's kind of a slightly sort of moment. You're making wine out of fungus. When on earth would you do that? But that really is the magic of what you do.
It can be very odd to see rotten grapes and to accept that those grapes will be pressed to make a wine. Usually you throw that away. But in Sauternes, this is what makes us winemakers. It's a very specific process that needs a microclimate that is present in Sauternes especially, where you need rain over ripe grapes, especially Sémillon, which is very suited to develop this noble rot, and it is a native variety of Sauternes. And after the rain, the fungus wakes up and invades all the vineyard and starts developing on the berries. They will turn purple. It means that they are being transformed by the fungus. It will transform the aromas, the texture, the color, everything. And then you need like 2 weeks of good weather after that, dry wind, warm afternoons, so that the grapes concentrate and lose 50% of their water content. And then you will go and pick only the grapes, the berries that have been concentrated by the dry weather. So you will go many times in the vineyard on the same vine, and each time you will pick only the parts of the bunch that have reached this concentration. So it's a long work of 2 months, a huge army of pickers also. Everything is manual, and you have to be patient and to accept that sometimes you have rain again, then you will have to wait again so that it concentrates. So it's very hard, but it's very satisfying at the end when you manage to taste the wine.
Generally, the perception of winemakers just being in the cellar, I think, is gone. We understand how much of the work is as secondary viticulturalists and being out in and amongst the vines. It sounds like for making this, that's even more so for you as the cellar master. You've really got to have an intimate understanding of what's going on in the vineyard.
Exactly, because when we decide to harvest, it's based on the concentration of the grapes and on the aspect. So you have to go to the vineyard frequently, day by day, and look at the vines everywhere, because if you miss a plot that is already concentrated, maybe it will be over-concentrated when you look at it, when you remember it exists. So you have to be aware of everything that's happening on the 100 hectares of the vineyard, and always be reactive and quick when you have to ask the pickers to go there and pick the grapes before it's too late.
A year or two ago, I think one of the most expensive bottles of wine ever sold in South Africa was an 1821 Groot Constantia. It was discovered in the bottom of a cellar somewhere. A friend of mine was involved in the recorking process. He had a quarter of a teaspoon of it and pronounced it absolutely outstanding. Is it the same with Chateau Yquem? Is this wine that 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe even more years on is still going to be in that kind of condition?
Yes, if the bottle is well preserved in good conditions. Usually when we bottle a vintage of Chateau d'Yquem, it's meant to live at least 100 years. But we have in our chateau, in our cellars in the chateau, a private collection. And the oldest bottle is from 1861. You have oldest bottles elsewhere in private cellars around the world. And I think when you taste those wines, it's always really impressive because it's more complex and more magnificent than any younger Yquem that you've tasted before. So yes.
Part of that, I'm sure, is the sugar content that gives it a sense of stability and allows it to more slowly develop over time. In terms of that change, though, and in terms of vintage to vintage, is this a wine that you try and create a mirror image of every vintage, or are you looking at what's come out of the vineyards and adapting according to each year?
We have a golden rule in Chateau d'Yquem. We always harvest grapes that are between 20 and 22% of potential alcohol in the wine. This rule will allow us to have the good concentration every year and the balance that is in the average of the Chateau d'Yquem vintages through history, between 30.5 to 14.5% of alcohol and 130 to 145 grams per liter. However, the vintage conditions will change every year, and the ripening conditions, this will have an impact on the aromas of the wine. So you may have similar concentrations, but the aromatic evolution through time in the bottle will be different for every year because you have different noble rod development conditions.
This is the 2021. As I'm approaching this wine, what for you as a cellar master should I be looking for in this wine that says to me, yep, this is really good stuff?
Yeah, maybe the aspects, the brilliance, the transparency of the wine is the first feature of Chateau d'Yquem. It's always golden light, very, very clean, very, very beautiful. Like it's a light, golden light going from the glass.
It is a glass of sunshine, isn't it? Oh. Okay, so we've got the aesthetic, which is fabulous. We then jump onto the nose. What am I looking for there? What am I expecting? What is this nose telling me?
On the young Yquems, you expect usually the dimension of exotic fruits, fresh fruits like guava, mango, passion fruit. You also expect the citrus family, some orange, candied orange, some lemon. And you have also the floral dimension, delicate white flowers like gardenia flowers, for example. This mix of fresh aromas and intense aromas is typical of the young Yquem that are between 2 to 5 years old.
So this is 2021.
Exactly.
When would this have been released?
It will be released in March, next month.
Okay, so this is still, we're getting
an avant-première.
Advance notice. All right, so 3 years then, that's roughly the time you're keeping this until it hits the market.
Yes, it's an aging of 2 years in barrels, French oak, new oak every year, 100%. After what, we bottle it, and then it stays in the cellars for like 6 months in bottles. After what, we release it, yes.
Okay, so we've got the colour, we've got the nose, now onto the big one, onto the palate. And the nose, it's got everything that you've said, but it also, there's a certain reserve to it. It's not screaming as something sweet and shouty, it's quite held back. So is it going to deliver something similar on the palate?
Yes, usually the palate is different from the nose in Chateau d'Yquem. It can complete it, but you will more focus on the reaction of your mouth to the wine more than on the aromas, and then the aromas will come back after that.
All right, you've more than piqued my interest, so let me have my first sip. First taste of the 2021 Chateau d'Yquem, appropriately on Tony's first trip to Africa. Now, aside from being glorious, which I could confidently have pronounced before I'd even drunk it, because that is the hallmark of Chateau d'Yquem, for me, as I'm sure it is for yourself and most people in our industry, it's a sense of balance that defines any great wine. And this throws out the window that mistaken belief I think a lot of South Africans have, whereby, oh, sweet wine, it's going to be sweet. And there certainly is sweetness in there, and the sugar content will be pronounced. But there is that wonderful savoury offset to it, and those citrus flavours, the stuff that's not super sweet, and it just gives it such a lovely sense of balance on the palate.
Yes, exactly. I think this is, as you said, one of the features of any great wine, the balance. That is even more important in a sweet wine, because we all fear the sweetness of a sweet wine. And I think Yquem, when we do the blend of Yquem, we always look for that. At first, we look for the balance. Every batch that has this balance in mouth is a good candidate to enter the blend of Chateau d'Yquem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The history, the heritage, Chateau d'Yquem, a world icon when it comes to wine, and a glorious example of just how, when you get that sense of balance right on a sweet wine, it is anything but. Cheers. This is Jamestown. It's the heart of the island of St. Helena. And if you look over my broad shoulder out to the bay, that's where Napoleon Bonaparte would have arrived in 1815 to begin the final 6 years of his life here on the island. And it was those 6 years that were helped out by some rather nice wine from Constantia. Now, we've heard with Tony El-Kawan, the cellar master at Yquem, the story of the great French sweet wine. Now to the story of the great Constantia sweet wine, and why it had such an impact on this rather well-known French empire who was sent to exile on the island of St. Helena, and along the way discovered just how good Constantia's suite could be. So on the list of bucket items to tick off for places you've had wine and ways you've experienced it that are pretty cool, and this is going quite near the top of the list because I'm drinking the modern iteration of the wine that Napoleon himself used to drink in the place that he used to drink it, because this is the home in which he spent the last 6 years or thereabouts of his life on the island of St. Helena. And not only am I drinking the wine of Constantia, which found such favour with the great French general, but I'm doing so with the consul here on the island. So a very, very important diplomatic figure who's agreed to share some wine with me this afternoon. Michelle, lovely to see you. And lovely to see you in these surrounds, because before we get to the cellar itself, which we're now in, this whole property, this whole home is so full of history, so full of beauty, and so richly intertwined with the story of Napoleon in his final years.
Yeah, so and you are most welcome here, and it's a nice way for most South Africans to come here and to discover the exile of another great prisoner. So and in the kitchen, people at the end of the promenade where we are, they can discover that Napoleon used to drink and eat. And that is the final touch of the tour.
Now this is going to throw people a bit, both when they arrive and then when they discover they used to drink wine, because there's this image for many that, well, Napoleon was exiled, he was a prisoner of war, so he must have been in some dark cell at the bottom of the island somewhere, not sitting in this sprawling house drinking fine wine from Constantia.
Yeah, that is exactly where St. Helena, as far as incarceration, is a bit special, because it's not an exile, it's not a prison. To make it short, it's just a deportation until he has been defined, and then it took 3 years for his jailers to define what will be the condemnation of Napoleon. So he was condemned to stay casted away from the known world. So just tell you what about St. Helena is, until his fame ends. So that means it's just, it's not a prison, it's not an exile, it's just to be cast away. So you can be cast away in comfort, don't you?
Well, I'd love to be if this is how it worked out, because he was here, he had 3 of his generals with him, he had a staff, they had some family, and he got to have great wine. And I think you said a little earlier on when we were having lunch over some Groot Constantia white, that if you were just a regular member of the army here in those days, it was a litre and a half of wine per day, was that right?
Yes, a litre and a quarter.
Litre and a quarter.
We have to...
Far more sensible.
It was an English measurement, so, you know, they have the pint and thing. So, yes, it's just a bit over a litre.
All right, so it was part of everyday life, even more so if you were a general who loved his food and wine. And I think beyond books, it was wine and then food that Napoleon was really putting his foot down on. This is what I must have on St. Helena.
Yeah, and don't forget the wine that was very much a social concern, because the wine, there was different classes of wine. I mean, the wine for the troops were far away from being served in Napoleon's table, even from the general. So there was very much different supplies of wine. So don't make me wrong. Here, with the Groot Constantia that you have in your glass, we are talking the top class. So that's definitely not the wine that the troop would have. So.
I shudder to think what that might have been, but thankfully that's not what I'm drinking today. Instead, I'm drinking the wine that he discovered. How did Napoleon, sitting here 2,000 kilometers from Cape Town on a rock, a beautiful rock, but a rock in the middle of nowhere, suddenly discover this?
Because don't forget, Constantia the wine of Constantia didn't wait for Napoleon to become famous. He was already served on the table of all court in Europe, from Prussia to Austria into UK. So it was a wine of novelties. It was a select wine already. So just that convinced Napoleon that the wine he should have. So that's the side of Napoleon which is a bit nouveau-riche, so that he would go for. So it's the wine which set a certain level of the class of the society you are.
Now, as with all great stories, you're never entirely sure how much is true and how much has been exaggerated. Just a little. I think you'll be able to tell me. I've heard Napoleon drank a bottle of this a day. He bathed in the stuff. It was every meal had at least a glass. What was the reality?
No, the reality, Napoleon liked his wine, but in more than moderation, because it would be half of a flute of champagne in the morning to wake up, and then he would have a finger drop of Vin Constance onto which he add water, so it's mostly use it like a cordial, really, and during his course, no wine at all, during his meals, and another glass of Constantia maybe in the afternoon, or maybe champagne, but that's about it. So it's very, no more than, in total, no more than a glass full of wine a day.
It was clearly the wine that he enjoyed, and so it's become part of the legacy of Napoleon, but also a really important part of the history of the wine of Constantia, which is why 200 years and change later, we're now sitting in this cellar on the island, Napoleon long gone, but I'm looking across and I'm seeing numerous bottles of Groot Constantia. That legacy has continued.
Yes, because that was for the bicentenary, and with the Groot Constantia wine farm, we decided we should use each other for us here to display the product and to sell them, but also for us to make a bit of promotion to the island, to Groot Constantia. So it's a winning side, and it's the more pleasant way to approach a sore subject, which is deportation of Napoleon to the end of the world. So that is, if you look at something which is as polemical than that, through the angle of the food and the wine, all goes so smooth. So
Napoleon left behind this incredible story that many people now come to the island to visit. It's one of the great attractions, touch on something of what Napoleon has left behind. How many people do you find coming to visit you here at the house, here at the museum, who know about that wine connection and have an interest in it?
Not enough, because St. Helena, unfortunately, and I'm glad that you're here because I'm sure you're going to change that. St. Helena remain quite select destination, and it's not very it's not famous. So we got about 2,000 to 3,000 people a year. So 2,000 between 2,000 and 3,000 visiting this house. So among them there will be 8% of very knowledgeable about Napoleon who's come to St. Helena because of the fame of Napoleon today. But 92% will still discover the Napoleonic heritage on St. Helena through as an occupation while they were going diving or hiking or whatever the island can offer. So those 92% have no knowledge of Napoleon. So therefore they're not very. They will not even know about Napoleon drinking wine. I mean, not knowing the man himself. So, yeah. But it is always a nice surprise that the tour can end up by wine. So it's civilized.
So there is education to be done, but you are seeing some progress.
Yes, we are. But it's also the fact that Most of the people never come to drive here to visit the house, so they can they always have a driver because the road of Saint Helena is difficult to drive on. So you experience that.
I did indeed.
So it's so they drink and if they want, and they even picnic. So with Groot Constantia in the back of their mind, and knowing a little bit more about a man they vaguely knew of his existence.
There's still a very small number of tourists who come to the island. It's not a big place. It is far away from the rest of the world.
Unfortunately, yeah.
But you're probably better placed than most, having been here now for so many years, having become, to all intents and purposes, one of the locals, to capture why all of these little pieces come together, the wine, Napoleon, the natural beauty, some of the friendliest people I've ever met, how those all come together to form this wonderfully alluring and appealing puzzle that is St. Helena.
That is what you have appreciated, obviously, since you're here. That is even less what it used to be. 30 years ago, it was what you have experienced in positive way, square. So it was huge. The solidarity, the friendliness, and so on was even more intense than it is now. Because 30 years ago we used to live as really as a true outcast community. So it was wonderful. So today the money element has come in, the communication, the internet, and so on. So it's less obvious. So, but I'm so glad that still 30 years ago, that you still you can sense that about the island. So I'm glad of that because that's what makes it special. It's the stress-free island and. Nothing matters really.
Well, what I love about it, just to complete the circle, is that 200 years ago South African wine arrived and found great favour, and now 2024 I'm arriving and I'm feeling quite at home and really enjoying myself. So that's carried on in a slightly different format, and I'm very glad for it.
Yeah, I'm glad that we can provide that, and for me South Africa is my second home. So. And I will definitely make sure South Africa is there. But it's a fact. The history of St. Helena belongs to the Cape Town and vice versa. Really much. I mean, you have no idea of how much the Cape Province has actually was depending on St. Helena as military and socially and so on. And St. Helena, how much it depends on South Africa. Yeah. So it's British, like when the UK, Cape Province used to be British. So you could see they were part of the same world. So independence of South Africa made St. Helena separated, but in heart they're together.
Well, I'm very glad that it's a local Frenchman who's brought us together on this particular day, channeling Napoleon into our time spent. Thank you so much for looking after us here. And as always happens when I get to travel around the world, when I find South African wine somewhere different, somewhere exotic, somewhere cool, I always get so proud and excited. But when I find it in the context of a story like this, I know the wine I'm drinking today from Groot Constantia is the latest generation of one that Napoleon and his generals and their team drank over 2 centuries ago, then that makes me even happier. Cheers.
Cheers.
Now, supposedly, Napoleon Bonaparte was here in exile, imprisoned for his misdemeanours and misdeeds in trying to take over the world. But he got to drink the sweet wine of Constantia every day, and he got to take in views like this. It surely cannot have been too bad, especially with such glorious wine. And it's glorious wine we've celebrated today, wine that I genuinely don't believe we appreciate enough, give enough time to. The sweet wine is a misnomer of a name for me, because both the Chateau and the 2 South Africans, the Van de Constance and the Grand Constance from Groot Constantia are wines that are far more than just sweet wines. There's a savoury element to them, a balance, a joy and a delight that really should be shared and explored a little more. And if you don't believe me, well, believe a guy called Napoleon Bonaparte, who found them as great companions here on the island. A big thank you to Matt Joshua and the team from St Helena Tourism, and to Aaron from Aaron's Adventure Tours, taking us around the island today, but also facilitated the experience of meeting so much of this island, its incredible people and its extraordinary charm. So do yourself two favours. Find yourself a bottle of Yquem or Van de Constance or Grand Constance and enjoy it, and book yourself a flight to St Helena. You're in for a very special time. This is Dan Really Likes Wine, brought to you by Norman Goodfellows. We'll see you again next week. Goodbye.